For 10,000 years, the Emperor of mankind had sat upon the golden throne of terror, neither living nor dead, sustained only by the arcane machinery of the Dark Age and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. His withered form had become legend, his silence a burden borne by an entire species. The imperium of man endured upon the foundation of his unending vigil, a galaxy-spanning civilization built upon the presumption that their master's consciousness fought eternal wars within the warp, while his physical shell remained motionless upon the seat of ultimate power. Yet even in the grim annals of the 41st millennium, there are moments when the impossible becomes inevitable. It began not with fanfare, but with the slightest tremor in the golden machinery that had hummed unchanged for millennia. The first sign was a fluctuation in the Astronomicon, that psychic beacon which guided humanity's ships through the treacherous currents of the warp. For a heartbeat that stretched across light years, the light that had burned constant since the heresy flickered. Navigators throughout the galaxy felt it in their bones, a momentary uncertainty that sent ice through their augmented hearts. On Terra itself, the tremor ran deeper. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood at his post in the Sanctum Imperialis, reviewing deployment schedules for the Custodian Guard, when the change struck him like a physical blow. Something fundamental had shifted in the psychic architecture of the Imperial Palace. The constant background presence that had defined his existence since childhood, the Emperor's will, vast and implacable, suddenly altered in pitch and tenor. Not absent, not diminished, but different. Wrong. His enhanced reflexes carried him toward the throne room before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Behind him, alert runes blazed to life across monitoring stations, as serfs and tech adepts registered anomalies in systems that had functioned without variation since the end of the heresy. The great doors of the Sanctum Imperialis stood open, revealing the approach to the most sacred chamber in human space. The throne room itself stretched before Valoris like a cathedral built for gods rather than mortals. Massive columns supported a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, while the golden throne dominated the far end of the chamber, its intricate mechanisms gleaming with an inner light that hurt to observe directly. Upon that throne, as always, sat the Emperor's physical form, desiccated, ancient beyond measure, kept functional by an impossible fusion of technology and faith. But as Valoris approached, something was different. The Emperor's head, which had rested at the same angle for centuries, now moved with agonizing slowness. The lips, cracked and dry as parchment, parted with the sound of breaking seals. When the Emperor's voice emerged, it carried the weight of absolute authority. Yet beneath that power lay something that had not been heard in 10,000 years. Uncertainty. Who am I? The words struck the throne room like a thunderclap. Every custodian guard in the chamber froze, their enhanced physiology struggling to process what they had heard. The Emperor had spoken, yes, but these were not the sparse, cosmic pronouncements they had been trained to expect. This was a question, a request for information, impossible. Valoris forced himself to approach the throne, despite every instinct screaming warnings. The Emperor's eyes, which had remained closed for millennia, now opened fully for the first time since the defeat of Horus. They blazed with familiar golden light, but within that radiance lay confusion rather than omniscience. The Emperor's gaze swept across the throne room with growing bewilderment. His voice came again, stronger now, carrying notes of mounting distress. What is this place? What has become of me? The psychic shockwave that accompanied these words was unlike anything experienced in recorded imperial history. It swept outward from the throne with the force of a stellar detonation, passing through adamantium walls and void shields as if they were mist. Every psyker on Terra felt it simultaneously, a consciousness of impossible magnitude awakening not to knowledge, but to ignorance. The wave continued outward, racing through the Sol system at the speed of thought, reaching even the most distant monitoring stations before dissipating into the wider galaxy. Valoris struggled to form words, his throat constricting with awe and terror. "My lord, you are the Emperor of mankind, Master of the Imperium, the God Emperor of God." The Emperor's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "I am no god. I feel no divinity within myself, only confusion, pain, and emptiness where knowledge should be." The Emperor attempted to shift his position on the throne, and the movement triggered cascading alerts throughout the monitoring systems. Mechanical servitors scuttled forward, their instruments detecting fluctuations in the throne's function that threatened the psychic barriers protecting Terra from the horrors that lay beyond the veil of reality. As the Emperor studied his own withered form, his face twisted with revulsion and incomprehension, the sight of his desiccated flesh, maintained by arcane machinery and sustained by constant sacrifice, clearly horrified him. Yet when he tried to understand how he had come to this state, his enhanced mind encountered only darkness where memory should have been. "How long?" he asked, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the very stones of the Imperial Palace. "How long have I been this?" Valoris felt the weight of 10 millennia pressing down upon him as he struggled to find words. 10,000 years, my lord, since the end of the Horus heresy. Since your battle with... I remember nothing. The Emperor's interruption carried such finality that it seemed to silence even the ambient sounds of the throne's machinery. Nothing of this heresy you speak of. Nothing of how I came to be bound to this device. Nothing of who I was before this moment. The psychic pressure emanating from the Emperor intensified as his confusion deepened, and several custodians who had approached too closely suddenly convulsed and fell. Their enhanced physiology, designed to withstand the proximity of their master's power, proved inadequate against the raw, uncontrolled force of his awakened consciousness. They died not from malice, but from the simple proximity to a mind that no longer understood its own strength. Valoris activated his voxcaster with hands that trembled despite his superhuman composure. Emergency Protocol Throne Alpha. All senior staff to immediate conference. Notify Lord Gilliman's fleet. Priority astropathic transmission. The Emperor has awakened. He paused, struggling with the impossibility of what he was about to say. The Emperor has awakened, and he remembers nothing. Throughout Terra, the implications of this moment began to cascade through the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium. The Astronomicon continued to flicker, its beam weakening as the Emperor's attention turned inward rather than outward. In the deepest tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, ancient seals that had held for millennia began to strain as the psychic barriers that maintained them wavered. Demons pressed against the boundaries of reality, sensing opportunity in the confusion of their greatest enemy. On the golden throne, the Emperor of mankind sat in the shadow of his own ignorance, master of nothing save the terrible power he could no longer properly control. The foundation upon which the Imperium of man had been built for 10,000 years had just cracked, and through that crack, darkness began to seep. The God Emperor was awake, but the man who had created that empire, who had walked among the nascent human race since before recorded history, who had sacrificed everything in pursuit of humanity's survival, that man was gone, lost in the depths of a mind that could remember only the present moment and the overwhelming weight of a responsibility he no longer understood. For the first time in 10 millennia, the future of humanity hung in the balance, not because of external threats, but because the one constant in their existence had become the ultimate unknown. The Emperor lived, but the Emperor as he had been was no more. And in the silence that followed this realization, the sound of the Golden Throne's machinery seemed suddenly fragile, a heartbeat that might stop at any moment. The silence that followed the Emperor's awakening stretched like a blade across the throne room, broken only by the labored breathing of the surviving custodians and the increasingly erratic humming of the Golden Throne's machinery. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood frozen before his master, the weight of 10 millennia of faith and duty warring with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. The Emperor of mankind, the foundation upon which the imperium had been built, stared back at him with the bewildered gaze of one who had awakened in a foreign land. The Emperor's voice, when it came again, carried the same terrible authority, yet beneath it lay something that had not been heard since the dark days of the heresy. Vulnerability, 10,000 years, he repeated, the words carrying harmonics that resonated through the adamantium walls. You claim I have sat here for 10,000 years, yet I remember only fragments of this moment. Pain beyond description, darkness pressing in from all sides. And he paused, his enhanced perception turning inward. A burden, something vast and crushing that I must bear, though I cannot recall what or why. Valoris forced himself to step closer, his enhanced physiology struggling against the raw psychic pressure emanating from the throne. My lord, you are the master of mankind, the God Emperor who united terror during the Age of Strife, who launched the Great Crusade to reclaim the galaxy for humanity. You created the Primarchs, led the Imperial forces during... Primarchs! The Emperor's interruption carried a note of almost desperate hope. These are... my sons? I have sons? 20 of them, my lord. Though... Valoris hesitated, unwilling to burden his master with the full scope of tragedy that had befallen his genetic progeny. Though not all remained loyal to your vision. The Emperor attempted to lean forward on the throne, and the movement sent cascading warnings through every monitoring system in the chamber. Tech adepts scurried between control stations, their augmented voices rising in binary cant as they struggled to compensate for fluctuations that threatened the delicate balance of forces keeping Terra itself stable. Show me, the Emperor commanded, his gaze fixing upon his own withered form with growing revulsion. Show me what I have become. Valoris gestured to one of the surviving custodians, who approached with a reflective surface normally used for ceremonial purposes. As the Emperor beheld his reflection, the desiccated flesh stretched over ancient bones, the life support tubes and psychic amplifiers that had sustained him through the long vigil, his expression transformed into something approaching horror. This is what preservation looks like in your Imperium, he asked, his voice carrying notes of bitter irony. I am more corpse than man. How do I even speak? How do I think? The Golden Throne sustains you, my lord, Valoris replied, though his own voice carried doubt. It has preserved your consciousness, while your body endured the wounds you suffered, defeating the arch-traitor Horus. Horus. The Emperor spoke the name as if tasting something foul. One of these Primarchs? One of my sons? Your most beloved son, my lord. He fell to chaos and led half your legions in rebellion against the Imperium. In the final battle, he mortally wounded you before you destroyed him utterly. The Emperor was silent for long moments, his psychic presence pressing against the walls of reality as he struggled to process information that should have been as familiar as breathing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of loss that seemed to shake the very foundations of the imperial palace. "I remember nothing of this Horus, nothing of these other suns you speak of, nothing of the imperium I supposedly created." His gaze swept across the throne room, taking in the vast machinery, the golden eagles, the countless devotional inscriptions. Yet all of this exists as testament to deeds I cannot recall. The Emperor attempted to shift his position again, and this time the movement triggered something more dangerous than mere mechanical alerts. Deep beneath the imperial palace, in tunnels that predated recorded history, ancient seals that had held for 10,000 years began to crack. The psychic barriers that the Emperor had maintained through his long vigil, barriers that kept the horrors of the warp from manifesting directly upon Terra, flickered like candle flames in a hurricane. Valoris felt the change immediately, his enhanced senses detecting the shift in the psychic architecture of the palace. Emergency runes blazed to life across monitoring stations as tech adepts registered breaches in containment systems that had functioned without fail since the end of the heresy. "My lord," Valoris said urgently, "you must focus. The barriers, the psychic defenses of Terra depend upon your will." "What barriers?" the Emperor asked, genuine confusion coloring his voice. "What defenses? I know nothing of such things." In the depths beneath them, something that had been held in check for millennia began to stir. The first demon manifestation was small, a lesser horror that squeezed through a crack in reality, like poison seeping through stone. It materialized in a forgotten maintenance tunnel 3 kilometers below the throne room, its presence immediately detected by automated systems that had been designed to monitor for exactly such incursions. The Emperor's head snapped up as if struck by lightning, his enhanced perception detecting the presence of something fundamentally antithetical to reality itself. Raw power blazed from his eyes as instinct took control where knowledge had failed. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice thundering through the chamber. "Something wrong. Something that should not exist." The psychic blast that followed was devastating in its uncontrolled fury. It raced through the palace like a tidal wave of pure force, striking the demon manifestation and obliterating it instantly. But the blast did not stop there. It continued through kilometers of adamantium and rockcrete, shattering containment fields, disrupting machinery, and sending dozens of palace staff into psychic shock. Valoris was thrown to his knees by the sheer magnitude of the release, his enhanced physiology the only thing preventing his immediate death. Around him, the few remaining custodians struggled to remain standing as the wave of uncontrolled power washed over them. "My lord!" Valoris gasped as the echoes faded. "You must control your strength. The palace, the entire planet, cannot withstand such releases of power." The Emperor stared at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time, horror dawning in his ancient features. "I did that? I destroyed that thing, without thought or intention?" "The demons are our eternal enemies, my lord. You have battled them for 10,000 years. Your will alone has kept them from Terra." "But I know nothing of how to maintain such defenses," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying a note of growing panic. "If these barriers you speak of depend upon my knowledge, then they are already failing." As if summoned by his words, proximity alerts began sounding throughout the palace. Deep-range augury detected movement in the forgotten spaces beneath Terra, movements that corresponded to no known imperial personnel or authorized activities. The demon incursion had been merely the first probe of weakened defenses. In the darkness below, More substantial horrors were beginning to take notice. Valoris activated his voxcaster again, his voice carrying the weight of desperate urgency. "Lord Commander Valdor, priority transmission to the Macrage's honor. Lord Guilliman must return to Terra immediately. The Emperor has awakened, but the barriers are failing. We require immediate reinforcement." The Emperor watched these preparations with growing comprehension of his situation. "This Guilliman, another of my sons?" "Yes, my lord. Robuta Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Regent of the Imperium. He returned to us 1 year ago, and has been leading the Indomitus Crusade to stabilize the galaxy after the emergence of the Great Rift." "Great Rift?" The Emperor's voice carried sharp alarm. "What catastrophe has befallen the galaxy?" Valoris hesitated, unwilling to burden his master with the full scope of the disasters that had unfolded during his vigil. "A massive warp storm, my lord. It divides the galaxy and has made travel and communication difficult across many sectors." The Emperor was silent for long moments, his consciousness turning outward to survey the state of his domain. What he found clearly disturbed him. The Astronomicon, which should have been as natural to him as breathing, felt foreign and uncontrolled. The psychic network that connected Terra to the far reaches of human space flickered like a damaged transmission. Across the galaxy, he could sense the presence of threats that stirred at the edge of perception. "How many of my sons remain?" he asked finally. "Active and loyal to the Imperium. Only Lord Guilliman has definitively returned. Others may yet live. Lord Russ departed into the Eye of Terror centuries ago seeking answers. The Lion's fate remains unknown. Lord Corax entered the warp in pursuit of traitors, but their status is uncertain." The Emperor absorbed this information with visible difficulty, his enhanced mind struggling to process the scope of loss and isolation. "And my enemies? These traitors you speak of?" "They serve chaos now, my lord. They have been transformed by the very powers that sought to corrupt your great crusade. They raid from the Eye of Terror and the Maelstrom, leading war bands of corrupted space marines against the Imperium." The weight of revelation pressed down upon the Emperor like a physical burden. He had awakened to find himself ruler of a dying empire, sustained by a faith he had never intended to inspire, surrounded by enemies he could not remember creating, and defended by sons he could no longer recall loving. Yet beneath the confusion and horror, something deeper stirred within him. The same will that had once united Terra under a single banner, that had launched the Great Crusade to reclaim the stars, that had sacrificed everything in pursuit of humanity's survival. Memory might be lost, but purpose, however dimly perceived, remained. "Then we must begin again," the Emperor said finally, his voice carrying the first notes of determination since his awakening. "If I cannot remember what I was, I must discover what I am. And if my empire is failing, then I must learn how to preserve it." The Golden Throne's machinery hummed around him, a mechanical heart that sustained both his life and the psychic barriers protecting Terra. Below, in the darkness, things that had waited 10,000 years for exactly such an opportunity began to move with greater purpose. The barriers were weakening, the light that had held them at bay was flickering, and the guardian who had maintained that vigil no longer remembered how to maintain the defense. The Emperor of mankind was awake, but the knowledge that made him master of his domain was gone. In its place was only raw power, desperate ignorance, and the growing weight of a responsibility he could feel but no longer comprehend. The Imperium's greatest hope had become its most dangerous vulnerability, and in the darkness between the stars, ancient enemies began to stir with anticipation. The war for Terra's soul was about to begin anew. The astropathic message that reached the Macragge's honor was unlike any transmission recorded in Imperial archives, where most psychic communications arrived as fragments of thought and emotion filtered through the chaos of the warp. This one blazed across the void with the desperate clarity of absolute emergency. Lord Commander Robert Guilliman felt it strike his consciousness like a bolt of lightning, the words of Captain General Valoris carrying implications that defied comprehension. The Emperor had awakened. The Emperor remembered nothing. Guilliman stood in the strategium of his flagship, surrounded by hololithic displays showing the disposition of Indomitus Crusade fleets across a dozen sectors. The Great Rift had torn the galaxy asunder, and every day brought new reports of worlds lost to demon incursion or traitor raids. The Crusade could not afford to lose its primary commander, not when so many systems hung in the balance between salvation and damnation. Yet duty to the Imperium paled before duty to the one being who had created it all. Lord Commander, Chief Librarian Togorius approached, with the measured step of one bearing unwelcome news. The astropathic choir reports increasing distortions in warp communications emanating from Terra. The Astronomican's signal strength has decreased by 12% in the past 6 hours. Guilliman absorbed this information, while his enhanced mind calculated the implications. If Terra's psychic beacon continued to weaken, entire sectors would be cut off from reliable warp navigation. The Indomitus Crusade would become impossible to coordinate, leaving isolated fleets to face the darkness alone. "Signal the fleet," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of decision that brooked no argument. "We make for Terra with all possible haste, abandon current objectives, and consolidate our fastest vessels for emergency transit." The Ultramarines. Chapter Master Calgar stepped forward, his scarred features expressing concern that went beyond tactical considerations. "My lord, the reports from Valoris. Is it possible? Can the Emperor truly have lost his memories?" "I do not know," Guilliman replied honestly. "But if there is even the slightest chance that our father requires aid, then no other consideration matters. The Crusade will endure our absence, or it will not. The Imperium cannot survive the loss of Terra." The journey back to the Sol system became a race against deteriorating conditions. With each passing hour, reports arrived of increased demon activity throughout the segmentum. Worlds that had been deemed secure suddenly found themselves beset by horrors that manifested without warning. The psychic barriers that protected Imperial space were weakening faster than anyone had anticipated. Guilliman spent the transit in contemplation, attempting to reconcile the father he remembered with the possibility that now awaited him. His last conversation with the Emperor had been difficult. 10,000 years of deification had created a gulf between them that neither had known how to bridge. The Emperor had seemed disappointed in what the Imperium had become, while Guilliman had struggled beneath the weight of expectations no mortal could fulfill. Now, perhaps, they would meet as strangers rather than as disappointed father and overwhelmed son. The Macragge's honor translated back into real space at the edge of the Sol system to find Terra wreathed in psychic storm clouds that had not existed during Guilliman's departure. The planet's aura, visible to psychically sensitive individuals, flickered like a candle flame guttering in wind. Where once the Emperor's will had blazed steady as a star, now something chaotic and uncontrolled sent ripples of disturbance across local space. "Lord Commander," reported Master of the Fleet, Cato Sicarius, "long-range augury detects multiple small craft engaged in combat operations within Terra's atmosphere. Imperial signatures, but irregular patterns, as if they are responding to threats that appear without warning." Guilliman nodded grimly. Demon incursions. The barriers are failing faster than anticipated. Signal Terra traffic control for priority landing clearance. We make directly for the Imperial Palace. The flight through Terra's atmosphere revealed the scope of the crisis to anyone with eyes to see. Pillar of smoke rose from multiple points across the planet's surface, where Imperial forces had engaged manifestations that should never have been able to reach real space. The golden eagles that adorned every Imperial structure seemed somehow dimmer, as if the faith that sustained them was wavering. As the Primarch's shuttle descended toward the palace landing platforms, Guilliman found himself confronting a possibility that terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. What if the being who awaited him in the throne room was truly a stranger? What if the Father who had created him, guided him, disappointed him, and defined his very existence was gone forever? The Imperial Palace stretched before him, as it had for 10 millennia, a monument to human ambition and divine authority built upon the bones of ancient Terra. Yet something fundamental had changed in its psychic architecture. The presence that had dominated this place since before recorded history now felt diminished, not absent, but confused, lost. Captain General Valoris met him at the entrance to the Sanctum Imperialis, the custodian's normally impassive features betraying signs of strain that spoke to the magnitude of the crisis. "Lord Guilliman," Valoris said, offering the ritual salute with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I am grateful for your swift return. The situation deteriorates by the hour." "Report," Guilliman commanded, as they walked toward the throne room. "The Emperor's awakening has triggered cascading failures throughout Terra's defensive systems. The psychic barriers that have protected us since the heresy are failing as his attention turns inward rather than outward. We have recorded 17 separate demon manifestations in the past 12 hours, each requiring substantial force to contain." They paused before the great doors of the throne room, and Guilliman felt something he had not experienced since his first approach to this chamber as a newly found Primarch: uncertainty about what awaited him within. Does he recognize anything? Anyone? Valoris shook his head. "Nothing, my lord. No memory of the Great Crusade, the heresy, the creation of the Primarchs. He knows he possesses great power, but not how to control it properly. Every emotional response triggers psychic phenomena that threaten the palace's stability." The doors opened to reveal the throne room, much as Guilliman remembered it, yet subtly changed. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne as he had for 10 millennia, but his posture was different, alert, aware. His ancient features turned toward the approaching figures with keen intelligence rather than the distant contemplation that had characterized their previous meetings. When the Emperor's gaze fell upon Guilliman, there was recognition, but not of the kind the Primarch had hoped for. "You are large," the Emperor observed, his voice carrying that familiar authority, yet tinged with confusion. "Enhanced beyond baseline human parameters. The genetic patterns, they seem familiar, yet I cannot place them." Guilliman approached the throne with careful steps, acutely aware that the being before him possessed the power to obliterate him with a thought. "My lord, I am Robut Guilliman. I was your son, one of the Primarchs you created to serve as generals in your great crusade." "My son," the Emperor repeated, the words carrying wonder rather than recognition. "You claim kinship with me, yet when I look upon you, I see a stranger. A magnificent stranger, but still unknown." The Primarch felt something crack within his primary heart, a pain he had not anticipated, to be forgotten by the one being whose approval he had spent centuries seeking, was a wound deeper than any blade could inflict. You created me, my lord. 19 others like me. We were scattered across the galaxy as infants by the powers of chaos. But you found us, raised us, led us in conquest of 1,000,000 worlds in humanity's name. The Emperor leaned forward with visible effort, his enhanced perception studying Guilliman with the intensity of one attempting to solve an impossible puzzle. I sense genetic familiarity in your structure. Your mind bears patterns that suggest common origin. Yet when I reach for the memory of creating you, I find only void. Guilliman's jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain composure. Perhaps if you attempted to access the throne's data systems, my lord, surely some record remains of— I have tried, the Emperor interrupted, his voice carrying frustration that reverberated through the chamber's walls. These machines respond to my touch, yet their purpose eludes me. I see readouts and measurements that should carry meaning, but they might as well be written in alien script. The tech adepts who maintained the throne's systems exchanged worried glances. If the Emperor could not properly interface with the Golden Throne, the psychic barriers protecting Terra would continue to degrade until nothing remained between the planet and the horrors of the warp. My lord, Guilliman said carefully, perhaps meditation might help. You were always a being of immense mental discipline. If the memories are not destroyed but merely displaced— The Emperor nodded slowly. Yes, I feel the echo of vast knowledge within my mind, but it remains beyond reach, like trying to grasp smoke or capture starlight in my hands. For the next several hours, Guilliman remained in the throne room, while the Emperor attempted various forms of mental exercise designed to unlock his missing memories. Occasionally, fragments would surface, a flash of recognition when certain concepts were mentioned, a moment of clarity when specific words were spoken, but each breakthrough proved ephemeral, leaving the Emperor more frustrated than before. As the day wore toward its end, emergency klaxons began sounding throughout the palace. The largest demon incursion yet recorded was manifesting in the ancient tunnels beneath the Sanctum Imperialis itself, and Imperial forces were struggling to contain entities that should never have been able to breach Terra's defenses so deeply. The Emperor rose from the throne with visible effort, his withered form supported by mechanical systems that hummed with increasing urgency. I must respond. These creatures, they feel wrong, antithetical to existence itself. My lord, wait, Guilliman began, but the Emperor was already focusing his will toward the disturbance below. The psychic blast that followed was even more powerful than his previous efforts, a wave of pure force that raced through kilometers of stone and metal to strike the demon manifestation. The entities were obliterated instantly, but the collateral damage was devastating. Entire sections of the palace lost power as energy conduits overloaded, and dozens of personnel were rendered unconscious by the psychic shockwave. In the aftermath of the release, father and son stood in silence, each contemplating the implications of what they had witnessed. The Emperor possessed the power to defend Terra, but without proper control, that defense might prove more destructive than the threats it sought to counter. I need to remember, the Emperor said finally, his voice carrying a note of desperate determination. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, I must recover what I have lost. The Imperium cannot survive its ruler being ignorant of how to rule. Guilliman nodded, though part of him wondered if the father he was trying to restore was truly the one the Imperium needed. Perhaps, in forgetting his past mistakes, the Emperor had also forgotten the harsh necessities that had made those mistakes inevitable. The first day of the Emperor's awakening was drawing to a close, and already the galaxy trembled at the implications of what was to come. in the throne room of Terra, two beings who should have known each other as father and son faced each other as strangers, united only in their determination to preserve the empire that neither of them truly understood anymore. The real test was yet to come. The great summoning began at dawn on Terra's second day of crisis. From across the segmentum, the most powerful psychers in Imperial service received urgent astropathic commands that brooked no delay or excuse. Chief librarians, sanctioned psychers of the highest grades, even carefully monitored representatives of the Scholastica Psychana, all were ordered to make immediate transit to Terra, regardless of current assignments or ongoing campaigns. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, ancient vaults that had remained sealed since the end of the heresy were opened for the first time in 10 millennia. Tech adepts moved through chambers filled with relics from the Emperor's long existence, each artifact potentially holding fragments of memory that might unlock what had been lost. The air itself seemed to thrum with accumulated power as objects that had witnessed the birth of the Imperium were carefully transported to the throne room. Chief Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines stood before the Golden Throne, his enhanced psychic abilities focused on the daunting task ahead. Around him, a carefully arranged circle of the Imperium's most gifted minds prepared for an undertaking that had never been attempted. The psychic reconstruction of a consciousness that spanned 40,000 years of human history. My lord, Tigurius addressed the Emperor with reverent determination. We have assembled relics from your past that may serve as focal points for memory recovery. With your permission, we will attempt to use them as guides to restore what has been lost. The Emperor studied the assembled artifacts with intense curiosity. A sword whose blade seemed to drink light itself, weapon that had once split reality to reach the Chaos God's domain. Fragments of technology from the dark age of technology, circuits that pulsed with barely contained energies. Personal items that had belonged to the Primarchs before their scattering, a book that had once belonged to Lorgar, a piece of ceramite that bore Horus's personal seal. These items feel significant, the Emperor said, his voice carrying undertones that resonated through the chamber's stone. When I look upon them, something stirs within the void where memory should be. Yet I cannot grasp what they represent. Gilliman observed the proceedings from a respectful distance, his enhanced features betraying the strain of watching his father struggle with concepts that should have been second nature. The sword was forged upon Molech, my lord, where you made a bargain with powers beyond mortal comprehension to gain the knowledge needed to create the Primarchs. The Emperor's hand moved toward the blade, stopping just short of contact. A bargain with whom? What powers? And why would I risk such a thing? Before anyone could answer, the Emperor grasped the sword's hilt. The psychic shockwave that followed was unlike anything recorded in Imperial archives. It began as a whisper in the warp and built to a psychic storm that swept across the Sol system in seconds. Every psyker within 1,000 light-years felt the Emperor's consciousness suddenly expand, touching memories that blazed like supernovas before fragmenting into incomprehensible chaos. Images flooded the throne room, not visions, but actual psychic projections of moments torn from the Emperor's past. The assembled psychers witnessed the unification of Terra, vast armies marching beneath golden eagles, the discovery of the first Primarch, a moment of joy so pure it brought tears to hardened warriors. The creation of the Space Marine Legions, genetic artistry on a scale that defied comprehension. But the memories came without context, without the connecting narrative that would make them comprehensible. The Emperor saw himself standing before 20 towering figures in armor that gleamed with inner light. Yet he could not recall their names or purposes. He witnessed the moment of Horus's corruption on Davin, but the betrayal appeared as random violence rather than the culmination of careful manipulation. "Stop," the Emperor commanded, releasing the sword as psychic feedback threatened to overwhelm even his enhanced consciousness. "These fragments, they show me deeds without meaning. I see myself committing acts of both creation and destruction, yet I understand neither the necessity nor the cost." Tigurius stepped forward, his own psyche reeling from exposure to memories that spanned millennia. "My lord, perhaps if we attempt a more gradual approach, individual memories rather than the flood of—" "No," the Emperor interrupted, his voice carrying harmonics of barely controlled frustration. "Show me the worst. If I am to understand what I have become, I must see what I have done." The chief librarian exchanged uncertain glances with his fellow psychers before selecting another artifact, a fragment of armor bearing the heraldry of the sons of Horus. As the Emperor touched the ceramite, new visions blazed to life with devastating clarity. The final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit unfolded before them in all its terrible glory. The Emperor watched himself confront a figure in black armor whose features bore a corrupted resemblance to his own genetic handiwork. He witnessed the moment of Horus's death, saw the agony in his own face as he obliterated the son he had loved most. He felt the mortal wounds that had consigned him to the Golden Throne, understood the price paid for humanity's survival. Yet even witnessing these pivotal moments, the Emperor felt no recognition of the participants. The being he saw destroying Horus was clearly himself, yet the emotional connection that should have accompanied such memories remained absent. "I killed him," the Emperor said quietly, his voice heavy with confusion rather than grief. "I killed this Horus, who was my son. Yet when I look upon his face, I feel nothing. No love, no betrayal, no loss. Only the cold assessment of a necessary action." Guilliman felt something twist within his primary heart at his father's words. To love and lose was one thing, to forget that love entirely was a wound beyond healing. "Perhaps," offered one of the sanctioned psychers, "the memories are not destroyed, but hidden. Some psychic trauma so severe that the mind has sealed them away to preserve sanity." Before the Emperor could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the palace with greater urgency than ever before. The largest demon incursion yet recorded was manifesting not in the deep tunnels, but in the upper levels of the Sanctum Imperialis itself. The psychic disturbances from the memory reconstruction had weakened the barriers sufficiently for entities of substantial power to breach Terra's defenses. Captain General Valoris burst into the throne room, his normally immaculate armor bearing scorch marks from recent combat. "My lord, we require immediate assistance. Greater demons have manifested in the Hall of Remembrance. Our forces are being overwhelmed." The Emperor rose from the throne with mechanical assistance, his enhanced senses immediately detecting the wrongness that permeated the palace's upper levels. "These creatures, they burn against perception itself. What are they?" "Demons of chaos, my lord, the eternal enemies of humanity and reality itself. You have battled them for 10,000 years. The Emperor nodded with grim understanding. "Then I shall battle them now, though I know not why they seek our destruction." What followed was the Emperor's first true combat engagement since his awakening, and it revealed both his retained capabilities and his dangerous limitations. His psychic power proved devastating against the demon incursion. Entities that had terrorized imperial forces simply ceased to exist when his attention fell upon them. Raw force blazed from his consciousness like solar radiation, burning away the manifestations with the fury of a star. Yet his tactical application of that power proved dangerously crude. Where once he might have precisely excised the demon presence while preserving imperial personnel and infrastructure, now he simply obliterated everything within the affected areas. 3 entire sections of the palace were reduced to molten slag as his uncontrolled power scoured the demon presence from reality. In the aftermath, as rescue teams searched for survivors in areas that now resembled the surface of a dead star, the Emperor surveyed the devastation with growing horror. "I did this," he said, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "In destroying our enemies, I have also destroyed our own people and structures." Tigurius approached carefully, his psychic senses still reeling from proximity to such overwhelming force. "My lord, your power remains absolute. It is only the knowledge of its proper application that has been lost." "Knowledge that included restraint," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying notes of bitter realization. "I possess the power to destroy worlds, yet I no longer remember how to save them." As the day wore toward evening, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the attempts at memory reconstruction. While fragments of the past could be recovered, they remained isolated incidents without the connective understanding that would make them meaningful. Worse, each attempt to access deeper memories triggered greater psychic disturbances, as if something actively resisted the restoration process. "My lord," Tigurius reported after hours of careful analysis, "we have discovered something troubling. The memory loss does not appear to be the result of trauma or damage. The patterns suggest deliberate excision, as if the memories were surgically removed by someone with intimate knowledge of psychic architecture." The Emperor absorbed this information with growing unease. "You suggest that someone deliberately stole my memories? Or," Gilliman interjected grimly, "that you removed them yourself, a conscious decision to forget rather than continue bearing the weight of what you had done." The implications of this possibility settled over the throne room like a shroud. If the Emperor had chosen to forget his past, then any attempt to restore it might be working against his own will. Yet without those memories, the Imperium faced collapse as the barriers protecting Terra continued to weaken with each passing hour. The Emperor contemplated the terrible choice that lay before him: remain ignorant but innocent, or recover knowledge that might prove too terrible to bear. In the darkness beyond the palace walls, entities that had waited 10,000 years for exactly such an opportunity began to gather with renewed purpose. The second day of the Emperor's awakening was drawing to a close, and already the cost of his ignorance was becoming clear. Power without wisdom was a weapon that destroyed friend and foe alike. The question that remained was whether the wisdom he sought was worth the price that recovering it might demand. In the depths of his consciousness, something stirred, not memory, but the shadow of memory, the echo of a decision made in desperation and sealed with will that had once moved galaxies, a choice to forget rather than face the truth of what necessity had made him become. The real question was whether that choice had been wisdom or cowardice, and whether the Imperium could survive either answer. The third dawn since the Emperor's awakening brought with it a catastrophe that had been building since the moment his attention turned inward rather than outward. Deep beneath the imperial palace, in tunnels that predated human civilization, ancient seals that had held for 10,000 years began to fail with the inexorable certainty of entropy itself. The breach had been Magnus the Red's greatest and most terrible gift to his father, a wound torn in reality during his desperate attempt to warn of Horus's treachery. For a century of centuries, the Emperor had maintained his vigil not merely to sustain the Astronomicon or guide humanity's destiny, but to hold closed a gateway that led directly into the heart of the webway. Through that portal, demon armies beyond counting pressed against barriers of will and psychic force, seeking entry into real space and the prize of terror itself. Now, as the Emperor struggled to comprehend his own nature, while his consciousness fragmented across failed attempts at memory restoration, that ancient wound began to bleed anew. The first sign came not from the deep monitoring stations that had watched the breach for millennia, but from the palace's vermin. Rats, roaches, and the countless small creatures that inhabited even the most sacred spaces of the Imperium began fleeing upward in waves, their primitive instincts detecting wrongness that sophisticated augurs had yet to register. Tech-Adept Prime. Belisarius Krall noticed the phenomenon first, his augmented senses detecting the exodus of biological matter from levels that should have remained sterile. His initial reports were logged but not prioritized until the first daemon manifestation erupted not from the breach itself, but from a maintenance tunnel 3 kilometers closer to the surface than any previous incursion. The creature that emerged was no lesser horror probing weakened defenses, but a herald of Khorne that had been waiting centuries for exactly this opportunity. Its materialization in the palace's mid-levels sent shock waves through every psychic detection system simultaneously, triggering alerts that had not sounded since the Siege of Terror itself. Captain General Valoris received the emergency reports while coordinating the aftermath of the previous day's devastating daemon incursion. The pattern that emerged from the data struck him with the force of revelation. The barriers weren't just weakening randomly, they were failing in a specific sequence from the deepest levels upward, as if something was systematically breaking them from within. "Lord Guilliman," he voxed to the Primarch, who was reviewing casualty reports from the Emperor's uncontrolled psychic strikes, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The deep breach is expanding." The words carried implications that both warriors understood with crystal clarity. The webway breach was not merely another threat to Terra's defenses, it was the threat. If it opened fully, demon armies that had been accumulating for 10 millennia would pour forth in numbers that no military force could hope to contain. Guilliman's response was immediate and decisive. "Signal all available Imperial Fists companies on Terra. Full mobilization for underground warfare protocols, and get me direct communication with the throne room." The Imperial Fists had maintained specialized companies trained specifically for combat in the palace's deepest levels. Warriors who knew the ancient tunnels, carried weapons designed for fighting in confined spaces, and understood the unique horrors that could emerge from breaches in reality. Now, for the first time since the heresy, they would face the enemy those preparations had been designed to counter. In the throne room, the Emperor sensed the expanding wrongness below, with senses that operated beyond normal perception. His enhanced consciousness, still struggling with the fragments of recovered memory, detected the presence of entities that registered as fundamental violations of natural order. "The breach," he said suddenly, interrupting Chief Librarian Tigurius mid-sentence during another attempt at memory reconstruction. Something stirs in the depths, something vast and hungry. Tigurius felt the Emperor's attention shift away from the artifacts they had been examining, turning instead toward the ancient wound that festered beneath the palace. "My lord, the webway breach has been contained for 10,000 years by your constant vigilance. If your attention wavers—" "I know nothing of this containment," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying mounting alarm. "I feel pressure from below, entities pressing against barriers I do not understand. How do I maintain defenses I cannot remember creating? The answer came not from Tigurius, but from the palace itself. Deep-range augers detected movement in the forgotten spaces beneath Terra. Not individual demon manifestations, but entire armies beginning to advance through tunnels that led inexorably upward. The seals that had held them at bay were failing faster than anyone had anticipated, and each failure opened the way for stronger entities to press forward. Gilliman reached the throne room as the first reports of sustained combat in the deep levels began arriving. The Imperial fists had engaged demon forces in tunnel systems 12 kilometers below the palace, and early reports suggested the enemy forces were far larger than initial estimates had indicated. "Father," Guilliman said, using the familial title despite the painful lack of recognition it evoked, "you must focus your will on the webway breach. The barriers that contain it require constant reinforcement from your consciousness." The Emperor turned his enhanced perception downward, attempting to comprehend the psychic architecture that had sustained Terra's defenses for 10 millennia. What he found defied his current understanding. Layers upon layers of warding, barriers woven from pure will and maintained by constant attention, all designed to contain something that pressed against them with the hunger of infinite damnation. "I see the structure," he said slowly, his voice carrying notes of desperate concentration. "But I do not understand how to maintain it. It is like trying to operate a device without knowing its purpose or function." The Emperor's first attempt to reinforce the failing barriers proved catastrophically inadequate. Raw psychic force blazed downward through kilometers of stone and steel, striking the breach with power sufficient to obliterate mountains. The immediate demon presence was annihilated, but the uncontrolled nature of the assault caused massive structural damage to the tunnels themselves. Entire sections of the deep palace collapsed as psychic energy overloaded ancient support systems. Worse, the crude application of power seemed to irritate the breach rather than seal it. Where precise psychic surgery had once maintained delicate barriers, now raw force created new fractures in the walls between realities. The opening began to widen as fundamental forces strained beyond their tolerances. In the tunnels below, Imperial Fists forces found themselves fighting a running retreat as demon armies poured through passages that should have remained sealed. Captain Lysander led his company through corridors that had not seen combat since the heresy, his thunderhammer crushing demon flesh, while his warriors laid down fields of fire that temporarily halted the advancing horrors. "Command, this is Lysander," he reported through Vox channels strained by psychic interference. "Enemy forces are far more numerous than anticipated. We're detecting greater demon signatures moving up from the deepest levels. Request immediate reinforcement and heavy weapon support." Above them, in the civilian sectors of the hive cities that crowned Terra's surface, the population began experiencing phenomena that had not occurred since the darkest days of Old Night. Spontaneous psychic manifestations erupted throughout the urban areas, as the weakening barriers allowed warp energy to bleed into real space. Citizens with no psychic training found themselves experiencing visions of entities that should not exist, while those with latent abilities suffered spontaneous awakening that drove many to madness. The Astronomicon itself began to fluctuate more dramatically, its beam wavering like a lighthouse in a storm. Across the galaxy, navigators attempting to use Terra's beacon for warp transit found themselves struggling with readings that shifted without warning. Several major shipping routes became impassable as the psychic lighthouse that guided humanity's interstellar travel proved increasingly unreliable. "Lord Commander," reported astropath transcendent Yasmin Nadu, her enhanced voice carrying strain that spoke to the magnitude of the crisis, "we are detecting massive disruptions in astropathic communication networks. multiple sectors have gone silent, and those still reporting indicate widespread confusion about navigational readings. Gilliman absorbed this information while coordinating the defense of Terra's deeper levels. The Emperor's memory loss was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure that threatened the fundamental infrastructure holding the Imperium together. "Can we provide the Emperor with technical specifications for the barrier maintenance?" he asked Tigurius. "Perhaps if he understands the mechanics of what he must do." "I have tried, my lord," the chief librarian replied wearily. "But the psychic architecture involved operates on levels beyond normal human comprehension. It requires not just knowledge, but experiential understanding built over centuries of practice." In the throne room, the Emperor continued, his increasingly desperate attempts to contain the expanding breach. Each effort produced temporary success, followed by greater failure, as his raw power proved inadequate for the delicate work required. The barriers needed constant, precise adjustment, like playing a musical instrument with infinite complexity while blind and deaf. As the day wore toward evening, the scope of the crisis became undeniable. Demon forces had established footholds in tunnel systems throughout the palace's lower levels. Imperial Fists companies were being driven back despite heroic resistance, and civilian populations across Terra were experiencing psychic phenomena that threatened to trigger planet-wide panic. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, his ancient features twisted with frustration and growing desperation. Around him, the greatest minds of the Imperium struggled to find solutions to a problem that might prove beyond mortal capacity to solve. "I am failing them," he said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the chamber walls. "Every moment I cannot remember how to maintain these defenses, more of our people die. More of the galaxy falls into darkness." Guilliman approached the throne, his massive frame dwarfed by the mechanical complexity that surrounded his father. "There must be another way. Some method of teaching you what you need to know without requiring the return of lost memories." The Emperor's gaze fixed upon his son with something approaching desperation. "Then find it quickly, for I sense that what stirs below grows stronger with each passing hour, and when the barriers finally fail completely, not even my power may be sufficient to prevent Terra from becoming another Eye of Terror. In the depths beneath them, ancient seals continued to crack under pressure that had been building for 10,000 years. Demon princes older than human civilization pressed against barriers of pure will, sensing weakness for the first time since their imprisonment. The race was on between the Emperor's growing understanding of his predicament and the inexorable expansion of forces that sought Terra's destruction. The third day of the awakening was drawing to a close, and the Imperium faced a crisis unlike any it had survived before. Not external conquest or internal rebellion, but the simple fact that the being who maintained the very foundations of human civilization could no longer remember how to perform that most crucial duty. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. The psychic shockwaves that had erupted from Terra with the Emperor's awakening continued to ripple outward through the galaxy, carrying implications that touched every corner of human space. What had begun as a localized crisis on humanity's throne world was becoming something far more profound, a galactic realignment that would reshape the balance of power across the stars. Deep within the rock, the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson felt the disturbance pierce through layers of stasis and healing that had sustained him for 10,000 years. The Primarch's enhanced physiology, designed to endure wounds that would destroy lesser beings, had spent millennia recovering from battles fought in the depths of Caliban. Yet now, as psychic resonance from Terra penetrated even the most shielded chambers of the rock, something fundamental stirred within the lion's consciousness. The awakening was not gentle. Lionel Jonsson erupted from his healing chamber with the fury of a storm given form, his enhanced senses immediately detecting wrongness in the psychic architecture of the galaxy itself. The presence that had dominated human space for 10 millennia, distant, implacable, but always constant, had changed in ways that defied comprehension. "My lord!" Supreme Grand Master Azrael rushed to the chamber as alerts sounded throughout the rock. The sight that greeted him would have driven lesser minds to madness. The lion, first among the Emperor's sons, alive and aware after centuries of hidden recovery, his eyes blazing with power that had not dimmed despite the long healing. "The Emperor," the lion said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the fortress monastery's adamantium bones. "Something has happened to our father. I feel his presence, but it is wrong, confused, as if a star had forgotten how to burn." The implication struck Azrael like a physical blow. If the lion was awakening now, after so many centuries of stasis, then the disturbance from Terra was beyond anything the Imperium had faced since the heresy itself. Far across the galaxy, in the nightmarish realm of the Eye of Terror, Leman Russ felt the same psychic resonance tear through the barriers between real space and the warp. The Wolf King had spent centuries hunting for the Tree of Life, seeking redemption for failures that had haunted him since the burning of Prospero. Now, as Terra's beacon flickered with uncertainty for the first time in 10 millennia, duty called with a voice that brooked no argument. "Pack leaders!" Russ's howl echoed through the great company that had followed him into damnation itself. "We return to Terra. Whatever hunt we pursue here pales before our father's need." The space wolves who had accompanied their Primarch into the Eye of Terror had been changed by their experiences in that realm of pure chaos. They bore scars that went beyond the physical, marks of battles fought against entities that defied rational description. Yet when their gene father called for Terror, they responded with the same loyalty that had carried them through the Great Crusade. On hundreds of imperial worlds, the Emperor's psychic disturbance manifested in ways that spoke to humanity's deepest fears and desperate hopes. Chaos cults that had hidden in shadows for generations suddenly found themselves experiencing visions of unprecedented clarity. The false Emperor, as they had been taught to call him, was weakening. The moment they had been promised for millennia was finally at hand. The first rebellions erupted on worlds where imperial control had always been tenuous. Governors who had maintained loyalty through fear and faith suddenly found themselves facing populations that no longer believed in the Imperium's divine mandate. Astropathic communications from dozens of systems carried the same message: open revolt, with cultists proclaiming the imminent fall of Terror itself. On Cadia's ruins, where the remnants of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade still smoldered, word-bearers sorcerers felt the shift in the galaxy's psychic currents like a physical revelation. Erebus himself, architect of so much treachery, emerged from meditation with understanding that brought savage joy to his corrupted features. "The Emperor falters," he announced to his assembled acolytes, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself recoil. "After 10,000 years of stagnation, the corpse god finally shows weakness. Signal the fleet commanders. We make for Terror." The word-bearers had waited longer than any other traitor legion for vindication of their faith in chaos. Now, sensing opportunity in the Emperor's distress, they began mobilizing forces that had been held in reserve since the end of the heresy. Dark ships stirred in hidden harbors throughout the Eye of Terror as the news spread. The Emperor of mankind was vulnerable. On Terror itself, the arrival of the Lion's fleet caused disruption that rippled through every level of imperial command. The Dark Angel's fortress monastery translated into real space at the edge of the Sol system without warning, its massive bulk accompanied by strike cruisers that had not been seen outside their hidden anchorage for centuries. Captain General Valoris received the astropathic identification with emotions that warred between relief and apprehension. Another loyal Primarch had returned in the Imperium's hour of need, but the circumstances of that return raised questions that had no comfortable answers. In the throne room, Guilliman watched his father's reaction as news of the Lion's approach was delivered. The Emperor's enhanced senses had detected the psychic signature of his son long before any physical scanner could register the approaching fleet. "Another," the Emperor said, his voice carrying wonder mixed with growing distress. "Another presence that feels familiar, yet strange. How many of these sons do I possess?" 20 were created originally, my lord, Guilliman replied, though the words carried weight that spoke to tragedies beyond counting. Not all remained loyal. Not all survived. The Emperor absorbed this information with visible difficulty. Each new revelation about his past seemed to increase, rather than diminish, his confusion. To possess such power yet lack the context to understand its purpose was a torment that grew more acute with each passing hour. The Lion's shuttle descended through Terra's atmosphere as demon incursions continued to erupt throughout the palace's lower levels. The sight that greeted the first Primarch as he disembarked spoke to the magnitude of the crisis. Smoke rising from multiple points across the Imperial Palace, emergency response teams moving with the urgency of wartime operations, and psychic disturbances that made the very air shimmer with unnatural energy. The reunion between father and son took place in the throne room, witnessed by Guilliman and the assembled leadership of Terra's defenses. Lionel Johnson approached the Golden Throne with the measured step of one who had walked among legends, yet even his enhanced composure showed strain as he beheld the Emperor's condition. "My lord," the Lion said, offering the same formal bow he had given 10,000 years ago upon first meeting his gene-father. "I am Lionel Johnson of Caliban, 1st Legion, the Dark Angels." The Emperor's gaze fixed upon the newcomer, with the same mixture of genetic recognition and complete unfamiliarity that had characterized his meeting with Guilliman. "You are magnificent," he said, his voice carrying notes of pride mixed with profound sadness. "I sense the echo of my own work in your structure, yet when I reach for memory of creating you, I find only darkness." The Lion's features, normally a mask of controlled emotion, betrayed a flicker of pain at his father's words. To be forgotten by the being who had given him purpose and meaning was a wound that cut deeper than any blade. "Perhaps," Guilliman interjected, "we might attempt to use the Lion's natural resistance to psychic influence as a shield during memory restoration attempts. If the Emperor's mind is being somehow protected or hidden by warp influence," Chief Librarian Tigurius, who had been analyzing the patterns of the Emperor's amnesia, looked up from his data with sudden interest. "My Lord Guilliman raises an intriguing possibility. The Lion's unique psychic resistance might indeed provide protection during deeper memory excavation." The Emperor studied both his sons with growing desperation. "You speak of these abilities as if they should be familiar to me, yet I know nothing of psychic resistance or memory excavation. I am lost in my own existence." As if summoned by his words of despair, new emergency alerts began sounding throughout the palace. Long-range augurs had detected multiple Chaos fleets moving through the Eye of Terror, their courses calculated to converge on the Sol system. The word-bearers were not alone in sensing opportunity. Other traitor legions were stirring from their ancient lairs, drawn by the scent of weakness from terror itself. "My lord," Valoris reported with urgent formality, "we have confirmed enemy fleet movements throughout Segmentum Solar. Multiple Traitor Legion elements are advancing on Terra. Estimated time of arrival, 14 standard days." The Emperor absorbed this information with a clarity that cut through his confusion like a blade through silk. "They come for me. These enemies sense my weakness and move to exploit it." The lion's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. "Then we prepare for siege. Terra has withstood such assaults before." "But never," Guilliman said grimly, "with the Emperor unable to maintain the psychic barriers that keep the planet stable. If the webway breach cannot be contained, it will not matter how well we fight. Terra itself will become uninhabitable." In the depths beneath them, the ancient seals continued to crack under pressure that had been building for 10 millennia. Demon armies pressed against barriers maintained by will that no longer understood its own purpose. Across the galaxy, forces both loyal and treacherous moved toward Terra, as the balance that had sustained human civilization for 10,000 years finally began to collapse. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, surrounded by suns he could not remember creating, facing enemies whose motivations he could not comprehend, struggling to maintain defenses he no longer understood. Yet beneath the confusion and frustration, something deeper stirred. The same will that had once unified Terra under a single banner, that had launched humanity toward the stars, that had sacrificed everything in pursuit of the species' survival. Memory might be lost, but purpose remained. And perhaps, in the crucible of the coming siege, both could be forged anew. The gathering storm was about to break upon Terra with fury that would shake the very foundations of reality. The question that remained was whether the Emperor and his sons could rediscover what they had lost before their enemies destroyed what they sought to protect. In the darkness between stars, ancient powers stirred with anticipation. The game that had begun, with humanity's first steps toward the stars, was entering its final phase, and the stakes had never been higher. The arrival of Leman Russ at Terra came not with fanfare, but with the grim inevitability of winter itself. The Wolf King's great company translated into real space at the edge of the Sol system, aboard ships that bore the scars of battles fought in realms where reality itself was negotiable. The space wolves who had followed their Primarch into the Eye of Terror returned as something more than they had been, tempered by horrors that would have broken lesser minds, yet still loyal to oaths sworn in blood and fire. Russ himself strode through the corridors of the Imperial Palace like a force of nature barely contained by human form. His armor, once pristine blue-gray, now bore marks that spoke to encounters with entities beyond mortal comprehension. Yet his eyes blazed with the same fierce intelligence that had made him the Emperor's executioner, the one son trusted to do what others couldn't. The Wolf King entered the throne room without ceremony, his enhanced senses immediately detecting the wrongness that permeated Terra's psychic architecture. When his gaze fell upon the Emperor, withered, confused, struggling with concepts that should have been second nature, something fundamental shifted in his expression. "So," Russ said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries spent hunting in darkness, "the rumors are true. Our father sits upon his throne, yet knows nothing of why he belongs there." The Emperor studied this newcomer with the same mixture of recognition and bewilderment that had characterized his meetings with the other Primarchs. Another son. I sense the genetic patterns, feel the echo of my own work, yet... He paused, his ancient features creasing with frustration. "Your presence carries familiarity, but I cannot grasp its meaning." Russ approached the golden throne with measured steps, his keen gaze taking in every detail of his father's condition. Unlike Gilliman's diplomatic caution or the lion's formal restraint, the Wolf King's response was characteristically direct. "Then I'll remind you," Russ said bluntly. "You created me to be your executioner. When other solutions failed, when diplomacy proved insufficient, when even your own sons needed to be corrected, you sent me to do what honor would not permit others to accomplish." The words struck the throne room like lightning, their implications reverberating through every mind present. Gilliman stepped forward, his voice carrying warning. "Brother, perhaps this is not—" "No," the Emperor interrupted, his voice suddenly carrying notes of steel that had not been heard since his awakening. "Let him speak. If I am to understand what I was, I must hear truth, not comfortable fiction." Russ nodded grimly. "Truth, then. You ordered me to Prospero to bring Magnus to account for his violation of your edicts. But that was not the first time you sent me to discipline a son. The 2nd and 11th Legions, their primarchs fell to corruption or madness, and you decided they could not be permitted to continue." The Emperor's enhanced perception turned inward, searching for memory of these events and finding only void. "I ordered the destruction of my own sons, my own creations?" "Aye," Russ replied without flinching, "and their entire legions with them. Tens of thousands of space marines, erased from history because their gene fathers proved unworthy of the trust you had placed in them. You told me it was necessary, that the survival of humanity demanded such sacrifices." The horror that crossed the Emperor's features was visible to every observer in the chamber. To possess the power to create life on such a scale, yet to use that same power for destruction, spoke to a ruthlessness that defied his current understanding of himself. "What manner of being was I," he asked quietly, "that I could order the death of my own children?" Before anyone could answer, the air in the throne room began to shimmer with energies that made reality itself recoil. A presence manifested, not physical, but psychic projection, so powerful that it achieved near material form. The figure that appeared bore the features of a primarch, yet transformed by powers that had elevated him beyond mortal limitations. Magnus the Red stood before the golden throne, his single eye blazing with power, drawn from the depths of the warp itself. The Crimson King's form flickered between states of existence, neither fully real nor entirely ethereal, yet undeniably present. "Father," Magnus said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical, "I felt your awakening across the galaxy. The psychic resonance of your confusion has been illuminating." Every custodian in the chamber raised weapons toward the projection, yet Magnus paid them no heed. His attention focused entirely upon the Emperor, studying his father's condition with the intensity of one solving a puzzle of cosmic significance. "Magnus," the Emperor said, the name carrying no recognition, yet somehow feeling correct upon his tongue. "You are my son?" "I was," Magnus replied, his form solidifying as his attention strengthened the projection. "Until you broke me. Until you sent your attack dog to destroy everything I had built upon Prospero. Until you chose ignorance over knowledge, superstition over understanding." Russ's hand moved to his blade, his enhanced physiology tensing for combat. "Speak carefully, sorcerer. Projection or not, I can still—" "Still what?" Magnus laughed, the sound carrying notes that made the chamber's stone resonate. "Kill me again? I am beyond your crude methods now, Wolf King. Death has proven educational." The Emperor raised one withered hand, his voice carrying authority that transcended his physical weakness. "Enough. If you are truly my son, then speak plainly. What knowledge do you offer?" Magnus's single eye fixed upon his father with something that might have been compassion. "I know what you have forgotten, father, and more importantly, I know why you chose to forget it." The implications of those words struck the assembly like a physical blow. Tigurius stepped forward, his psychic senses detecting patterns in Magnus's projection that suggested deeper truth. "You claim the Emperor's amnesia is self-inflicted?" the chief librarian asked. "Not amnesia," Magnus corrected. "Excision, a surgical removal of memories too terrible to bear. Tell me, father, what do you remember of the war in heaven? Of the deal you made with the chaos gods themselves? Of the bargain that gave you the power to create us, your sons, but at a cost that would damn the galaxy?" The Emperor's enhanced mind recoiled from the implications even as fragments of understanding began to surface. Flashes of memory, not recent, but ancient beyond measure. Moments of decision where necessity had demanded choices that no being should have to make. "I made a bargain with chaos?" The words emerged as barely a whisper. "You stole their power," Magnus replied with savage satisfaction. "Took what you needed to create the Primarchs and cast aside the consequences. 20 suns scattered across the galaxy by powers you had betrayed. A great crusade built upon lies and necessity. An imperium sustained by the suffering of billions." Before Magnus could continue, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the throne room. The doors opened to admit a figure that carried the weight of 10,000 years upon his massive frame. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, ancient of the Space Wolves, entered with mechanical limbs that had replaced flesh destroyed in battles beyond counting. "Enough!" the ancient rumbled, his voice emerging from vox grills that had spoken witness to history itself. "Magnus speaks truth, but not the whole of it. I was there, Wolf King, when our father first united Terra. I remember the vision that drove him to such desperate measures." Even Russ stepped aside as the ancient approached the throne. Bjorn was older than any living being in the chamber, save the Emperor himself, a witness to the Great Crusade from its very beginning, keeper of memories that predated the Imperium itself. "My lord," Bjorn addressed the Emperor with reverence earned through millennia of service, "you were not always the being you became. Once you had a different dream. Unity through understanding rather than conquest. Peace through knowledge rather than force." The Emperor leaned forward, his attention focusing on the ancient with desperate intensity. "Then what changed me? What transformed this vision of peace into one of conquest and control?" "Reality," Bjorn replied simply. "Humanity was not ready for your golden path. The galaxy was too dangerous for gentle guidance. Chaos was already stirring, the warp was becoming poisoned by the emotions of thinking with beings, and time was running short. So you made the hard choices, chose survival over idealism, chose to become the tyrant the species needed rather than the leader they deserved." Magnus's projection flickered with what might have been approval. "And when the weight of those choices became too great to bear, when the guilt and horror of what you had become threatened your sanity, you chose to forget, to extise the memories that made you a monster so that you might continue functioning as a god." The Emperor absorbed these revelations with growing horror. Every choice described felt alien to his current understanding of himself, yet he could not deny the logic that connected them. A being of his power, faced with extinction of the species he sought to protect, might indeed make such terrible decisions. "If this is true," he said finally, "if I chose to forget rather than face what I had become, then perhaps those memories should remain lost. Perhaps ignorance is preferable to such knowledge." "Perhaps," Magnus agreed, his single eye blazing with power that drew its strength from dimensions beyond counting. But ignoring truth does not change it, and right now, Father, the Imperium needs the being you were, not the being you wish you could be. In the depths beneath them, the ancient seals continued to crack as demon armies pressed against barriers maintained by will that no longer understood its purpose. Across the galaxy, chaos forces converged on Terra, while Imperial defenders struggled to maintain order without clear guidance from their ultimate authority. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, surrounded by revelations that painted his past in shades of necessary evil and pragmatic horror. The choice that lay before him was perhaps the cruelest of all. Embrace the monster he had been, or remain ignorant while the civilization he had built collapsed around him. The weight of absolute power was not in its possession, but in the knowledge of what its exercise demanded. And that knowledge, once regained, could never again be forgotten. The alarm klaxons that pierced the imperial palace carried a note of finality that had not been heard since the siege of Terra 10,000 years ago. Long-range augury stations throughout the Sol system transmitted the same impossible message. Word-bearers' assault fleets had translated into real space at the edge of the system, their dark hulls bearing the corruption of millennia spent in service to the Chaos Gods. The Emperor felt their arrival like a cancer pressing against his consciousness, not through any recovered memory, but through the simple recognition that these entities carried wrongness so profound it made reality itself recoil. Yet even as he sensed the approaching threat, his attention remained divided by the choice that Magnus had laid before him. "They come for Terra now," Captain General Valoris reported, his voice carrying the weight of duty that had sustained the custodians through 10,000 years of vigilance. Estimated time to planetary bombardment range, 8 hours. Request immediate strategic guidance. The Emperor turned his withered features toward his assembled sons, seeing in their faces the reflection of his own terrible uncertainty. Guilliman's expression carried the pragmatic assessment of one who had led armies across 1,000 battlefields. The lion's features showed the controlled tension of a warrior, calculating odds and finding them wanting. Even Russ, normally eager for battle, bore the grim understanding that this fight might demand more than martial prowess could provide. "Father," Guilliman said carefully, "we need your full capabilities if we are to defend Terra effectively. The barriers protecting the planet continue to fail, and without proper guidance, our forces cannot coordinate an effective response." The lion nodded grimly. "The enemy comes at their chosen time, knowing we are weakened. To face them while you remain diminished is to invite disaster." Yet Russ, ever the contrarian, stepped forward with his characteristic bluntness. "And if the cure proves worse than the disease? If remembering what you were destroys what you might become?" Magnus's projection flickered as his attention strengthened, the psychic energy required to maintain coherent form across such distances, taxing even his enhanced abilities. "The choice must be made now, Father. I can feel the approaching Chaos fleets. Their presence strengthens my connection to this realm, but it also means our window of opportunity narrows with each passing moment." The Emperor absorbed their counsel, while his enhanced senses detected the systematic degradation of Terra's defenses. Below, in the ancient tunnels, demon armies pressed against barriers that grew weaker with his divided attention. Above, in the void of space, ships bearing the 8-pointed star of chaos advanced with the inexorable certainty of judgment itself. "Tell me plainly, the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the physical. What exactly do you offer, Magnus? What price would your assistance demand? Magnus's single eye blazed with power, drawn from realms where mathematics became theology, and knowledge transcended mere information. I offer complete restoration of what you have lost. Every memory, every experience, every choice that made you the master of mankind. But the process cannot be selective. You will remember the necessity that drove you to create the Primarchs, and you will also remember the guilt that drove you to forget. The Emperor leaned back in the golden throne, feeling the weight of machinery that had sustained him for 10 millennia, pressing against flesh that had already sacrificed everything for humanity's survival. And your price? Understanding, Magnus replied simply. When you remember what drove me to chaos, you will also remember why your path led to such desperate measures. Perhaps then we might find common purpose rather than eternal enmity. Guilliman stepped forward, his massive form radiating controlled urgency. My lord, the strategic situation deteriorates rapidly. We need a decision now. The Emperor closed his eyes, turning his consciousness inward toward the vast emptiness where memory should have dwelt. For a moment that stretched across heartbeats, he attempted to comprehend what 40,000 years of existence might contain, the triumphs and tragedies, the moments of sublime creation and terrible destruction, the weight of choices that had shaped the destiny of an entire species. In that moment of deep introspection, something stirred within the void. Not complete memory, but fragments of emotion so powerful they had survived even surgical excision. The sensation of genetic patterns taking shape under his will, the joy of creation that transcended mere scientific achievement, the love, vast, paternal, overwhelming, for beings who had carried his hopes across the galaxy. When the Emperor opened his eyes, tears of golden light traced paths down his withered cheeks. I remember creating you, he whispered, his gaze moving between his 3 surviving sons. Not the details, not the methods, but the emotion, the hope each of you represented, the pride I felt as you took your first breaths, the love. His voice broke as the weight of that recovered emotion struck him with the force of stellar collapse. To love beings so profoundly, then to forget them entirely, was a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury. Guilliman felt something crack within his primary heart at his father's words, to be remembered not as a tactical asset or genetic creation, but as a beloved son, carried implications that transformed everything he understood about their relationship. The lion's normally impassive features showed a flicker of emotion that spoke to wounds carried for 10,000 years. Even Russ, master of controlled fury, seemed moved by the raw grief in his father's voice. If I can recover that, the Emperor said, his voice strengthening with each word, then perhaps I can recover the wisdom to protect it. Magnus, I accept your offer. Whatever the cost, whatever the revelation, I must remember who I was, to become who I need to be. Magnus's projection solidified as his attention focused completely on the task ahead. Then we begin. But know this, Father. Once started, the process cannot be stopped. You will remember everything, including truths that may shatter your current understanding of yourself. The Emperor nodded with the grim determination of one who had already paid the ultimate price multiple times over. Begin. What followed was unlike any psychic phenomenon recorded in Imperial archives. Magnus reached across the barriers between real space and the warp, his consciousness touching the edges of his father's mind with surgical precision, born of millennia spent studying the deepest mysteries of existence. The connection, once established, blazed with power that made the air itself shimmer with barely contained energies. The first wave of recovered memories struck the Emperor like a tsunami of pure information. The unification of terror exploded across his consciousness in full detail, not the sanitized histories recorded in imperial texts, but the brutal reality of conquest and conversion. He saw himself standing over the corpses of techno-barbarian kings, felt again the weight of choices that prioritized species survival over individual mercy. The second wave brought the creation of the Primarchs in all its terrible glory. He remembered the bargain struck on Moloch, the knowledge stolen from powers that transcended mortal understanding, the genetic artistry that had produced 20 perfect sons. But with that triumph came the memory of what it had cost, not just the deal with chaos, but the compromises, the calculated risks, the willingness to use his own children as instruments of policy. As the process continued, emergency alerts began sounding throughout the palace with increasing urgency. The word-bearers' assault had reached Terra's outer defenses, and their bombardment was beginning to overwhelm shield generators that had protected the throne world for millennia. Imperial navy vessels engaged the traitor fleets in void battles that painted space itself with the light of dying stars. Through it all, the Emperor endured the return of 40,000 years of memory with the stoic determination that had once conquered a galaxy. Each recovered experience built upon the last, creating a mosaic of understanding that grew more terrible and more magnificent with each passing moment. He remembered the love he had felt for each Primarch, but also the calculations that had determined which of them might need to be sacrificed for the greater good. He remembered the vision of human unity that had driven the Great Crusade, but also the compromises that had turned idealism into pragmatism, hope into necessity. The final wave of memories centered on the moment of his entombment upon the Golden Throne. He remembered the choice to forget, not made in madness or despair, but with the cold logic of one who understood that some knowledge was too terrible for any mind to bear indefinitely. The decision to excise his own guilt and horror so that he might continue functioning as humanity's guardian, even if it meant sacrificing the wisdom that had created the problems in the first place. When the process finally ended, the being who opened his eyes upon the Golden Throne was no longer the confused entity who had awakened days earlier. This was the Emperor of mankind in full, master of humanity's destiny, architect of impossible ambition, and bearer of guilt that spanned millennia. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was also more than he had been before the forgetting. "I remember," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the palace's adamantium bones. "I remember it all. Every choice, every sacrifice, every moment where necessity demanded the impossible." The Emperor rose from the Golden Throne under his own power for the first time in 10,000 years, life support systems disengaging as vitality that had been contained by machinery flowed freely through his restored form. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of absolute power, tempered by hard-won wisdom. "And I remember why I chose to forget. The weight of what I had done, what I had become, was indeed too great for any mind to bear indefinitely." His gaze moved between his sons, seeing them now not as strangers, but as beloved children whose pain he had helped to cause. But forgetting did not change what I had done. It only ensured that the lessons learned through suffering would be lost. Outside, the word-bearer's assault reached Terra's atmosphere as dark ships descended toward the imperial palace, like harbingers of judgment itself. But now they faced not a confused shadow of former glory, but the master of mankind restored to full power and terrible purpose. The real war was about to begin. The emperor who rose from the golden throne was not the same being who had awakened in confusion days before, nor was he identical to the master of mankind who had fallen in battle against Horus 10,000 years ago. This was something new, a consciousness that bore the weight of 40 millennia, yet had been tempered by the experience of forgetting and the choice to remember. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the physical, yet beneath that cosmic authority lay something that had not existed before. Humility, earned through ignorance. "The breach," he said, his consciousness turning toward the ancient wound festering beneath the palace. 10,000 years I have maintained it through brute force and endless vigilance. Now I remember the proper techniques. What followed was precision beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor's will descended through kilometers of stone and steel, touching the barriers that contained the webway breach with surgical accuracy that made his previous crude attempts seem like a child's scribbling. Where raw power had failed, knowledge succeeded. Ancient seals that had been cracking under pressure for days suddenly solidified, reinforced by understanding that transcended mere psychic strength. The change was immediately apparent throughout the palace. Tech adepts monitoring the deep levels registered containment field strengths rising to levels not seen since the throne's original construction. The daemon armies that had been pressing against weakened barriers found themselves facing walls of pure will that might as well have been built from adamantium and faith. In the tunnels below, Imperial Fist's forces, who had been fighting desperate rearguard actions, suddenly found their enemies simply gone. Captain Lysander led his company through corridors that, moments before, had echoed with the sounds of demon manifestation, now empty save for the lingering scent of sulfur and the whisper of displaced air. "Command!" Lysander reported, his voice carrying wonder despite his superhuman composure. "The enemy has withdrawn from all contact points. The breach appears to be stable." But the Emperor's attention had already shifted to the greater threat approaching Terra's upper atmosphere. Through senses that operated beyond normal perception, he assessed the word-bearer's assault fleet with tactical acuity that had once conquered a galaxy. 17 heavy cruisers, 43 escort vessels, and a flagship that bore the corrupted benedictions of 4 chaos gods. More importantly, he sensed the presence commanding that fleet, a consciousness he had known since its first breath, now twisted by millennia of service to powers that fed on mortal suffering. "Lorgar," the Emperor said, the name carrying notes of grief that spoke to wounds deeper than any physical injury. "My son approaches with fire, and faith perverted beyond recognition." The coordinated defense that followed demonstrated why the Emperor had once been considered the greatest military mind in human history. Orders blazed across Terra's command networks with clarity that cut through confusion like a blade through silk. Imperial Navy squadrons received targeting priorities with surgical precision. Defense platforms that had been firing randomly into the void suddenly coordinated their volleys for maximum effect. The phalanx itself, ancient fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, received movement instructions that would bring its massive weapons to bear at precisely the moment when word-bearers' shields would be weakest. Gilliman watched his father orchestrate Terra's defense with awe that transcended his own considerable tactical abilities. This was warfare conducted at a level that made even Primarch intellect seem clumsy by comparison. Every decision considered variables that stretched across multiple star systems, every order calculated to achieve objectives that would not become apparent until hours after their execution. "Father," Guilliman said, his voice carrying reverence earned through newfound understanding, "your tactical brilliance remains undiminished." The Emperor turned his gaze toward his son, seeing him now not as a stranger, but as a beloved child whose pain he had helped to cause. "Brilliance born of necessity, my son. 10,000 years of stagnation taught me what my previous existence had not, that knowledge without wisdom is merely cleverness, and power without understanding is simply destruction." The first word-bearer's landing craft began their descent toward Terra's surface as the Emperor's strategic coordination reached its crescendo. Imperial fists companies moved to intercept with precision that turned what should have been scattered resistance into concentrated devastation. Custodian guards took positions calculated not just for immediate tactical advantage, but to funnel enemy forces into kill zones that would maximize the psychological impact of their destruction. Yet even as Terra's defenses operated with renewed efficiency, the Emperor's enhanced senses detected something more dangerous than mere military assault. A psychic presence was manifesting in orbit above the planet, not a physical form, but a projection of will and corruption so powerful that it achieved near-material coherence. Lorgar Aurelian materialized in the void above Terra, his form wreathed in energies drawn from the deepest wells of chaos worship. The word-bearer Primarch had transcended mortality through devotion to powers that existed beyond human comprehension, becoming something that was neither fully demon nor entirely real. When he spoke, his voice carried across the vacuum through means that defied physics. "Father." Lorgar's words reached every mind on Terra simultaneously, carried by psychic projection that turned thought itself into weapon. "I have come to witness your final defeat, to see the false Emperor cast down by the very powers you sought to deny." The Emperor's response blazed across the void with authority that made stellar radiation seem pale by comparison. Where Lorgar's voice had carried corruption and madness, his words brought clarity that cut through 10,000 years of accumulated lies. "My son," the Emperor said, his consciousness reaching through dimensions to touch the edges of Lorgar's transformed existence. "I remember now why you fell to chaos, not from malice, but from a need for meaning that I failed to provide. For that failure, I accept responsibility." The acknowledgement struck Lorgar with greater force than any physical blow could have achieved. For millennia, the word-bearer had expected rage, denial, or condemnation from his gene father. To receive understanding and acceptance of fault was a response for which 10,000 years of corruption had not prepared him. "You accept blame?" Lorgar's projection flickered as confusion disrupted his concentration. "You, who demanded worship while denying divinity. You, who created gods, then insisted we call them men. I created you to be my sons, not my slaves," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying grief that transcended individual loss. "I failed to see that in denying you purpose beyond conquest, I left you vulnerable to those who would provide meaning through corruption. That failure belongs to me alone." The battle in Terra's upper atmosphere continued as father and son engaged in dialogue that bridged the gulf between order and chaos. Imperial forces pressed their advantage with tactical coordination that turned the word-bearer's assault into a rout, while in the void above, two beings who had once shared love struggled to understand how necessity had transformed affection into enmity. "Will you return to us?" the Emperor asked finally. "Not as you were, for that being is gone, but as what you might become. The imperium I built was flawed, but perhaps together we might create something better. Lorgar's response came not in words, but in raw emotion that blazed across psychic dimensions like a solar flare. Millennia of pain, corruption, and service to powers that fed on suffering had changed him beyond any possibility of redemption. Yet beneath that accumulated darkness, something flickered that might once have been love. "It is too late for me, Father," Lorgar said finally, his projection beginning to fade as the effort of maintaining coherent form across such distances taxed even his enhanced abilities. "But perhaps it is not too late for what we built together." The word-bearer, Primarch's presence, dissipated like smoke in wind, leaving only the bitter knowledge that some wounds could not be healed, some choices could not be unmade. The physical assault continued for several more hours, but without their spiritual leader's presence to sustain them, the word-bearer's forces began to lose cohesion. By Terra's dawn, the last enemy vessel had been destroyed or driven from the system. In the aftermath of victory, the Emperor stood in the throne room surrounded by his surviving sons, yet the triumph felt hollow rather than complete. They had preserved Terra and sealed the ancient breach, but the cost of that success included the final confirmation that some of his children were lost beyond any hope of recovery. "We must speak honestly," the Emperor said, his gaze moving between Gilliman, the lion, and Russ. "About what I was, what you have become, and what we might build together. The imperium I created was born of necessity and fear. It has endured for 10,000 years through faith and sacrifice, but endurance is not the same as success." Gilliman stepped forward, his massive frame radiating the same mixture of hope and caution that had characterized his rule as Lord Regent. "What do you propose, Father?" "Change," the Emperor replied simply. "Not the destruction of what we have built, but its transformation into what it was always meant to become. An empire that serves humanity rather than consuming it. A civilization that inspires rather than merely endures." The conversation that followed lasted through Terra's night and into the following day. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor of mankind engaged in true dialogue with his sons, not as master dictating to servants, but as father seeking counsel from those he had failed, yet who had somehow forgiven him despite that failure. The imperium would never be the same. Whether it would become something better remained to be seen. But for the first time since the dark days of the heresy, there was hope that humanity's future might be shaped by wisdom rather than mere necessity. The master of mankind had returned. But perhaps more importantly, the father had finally come home. The great conclave that assembled in Terra's Hall of Triumph 3 days after the word-bearer's defeat was unlike any gathering seen since the darkest days of the heresy. Where once the Emperor had dictated policy from the isolation of the Golden Throne, now he sat among his sons as an equal. First among equals, perhaps, but no longer the distant deity whose will brooked no question or debate. Robert Gilliman occupied the chair to his right, the position of honor that acknowledged both his role as Lord Regent and his experience governing the Imperium during the Emperor's long stasis. Lionel Johnson sat opposite, his tactical acumen serving as counterpoint to his brother's administrative expertise. Leman Russ claimed a position that allowed him to watch all approaches, the Wolf King's instincts remaining sharp despite the formal setting. "We gather not as master and servants," the Emperor began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power, yet tempered by hard-won wisdom, "but as family seeking to heal wounds that have festered for 10,000 years. The imperium I created was born of necessity and shaped by fear. It has endured through faith and sacrifice, but survival is not the same as success. The proposal he outlined over the following hours represented nothing less than a fundamental transformation of human governance. Where the imperium had been sustained by rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, the new covenant would emphasize shared responsibility and collaborative decision-making. The Primarchs would not merely be generals executing their father's will, but partners in shaping humanity's destiny. The Codex Astartes served its purpose, the Emperor said, his gaze fixing on Guilliman with something that might have been paternal pride. But it was written for a galaxy at war, not one seeking peace. We must craft new doctrines that serve humanity's growth rather than merely its survival. Guilliman leaned forward, his enhanced mind already calculating the implications of such sweeping reforms. The administrative complexity alone would be staggering, Father. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds, each with unique needs and circumstances. Coordinating such diversity under a collaborative model, which is why we begin gradually, the Emperor replied. Not wholesale revolution that would trigger civil war, but careful evolution that preserves stability while enabling growth. The Ultramar model you have implemented provides an excellent foundation for expansion. The Lion's tactical instincts identified the strategic vulnerabilities in such an approach. The High Lords will resist. 10,000 years of accumulated power does not yield easily to reform, regardless of who proposes it. As if summoned by his words, the massive doors of the hall opened to admit the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords of Terra, whose collective authority had governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name since his entombment. Their entrance carried the weight of institutional power that had endured longer than many stellar civilizations. High Lord Chancellor Lev Tiron led the delegation, his augmented features betraying no emotion as he approached the assembly. Behind him followed the representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Navy, the Astra Militarum, and a dozen other institutions that had shaped imperial policy for millennia. "My lord," Tiron said, offering the ritual genuflection that protocol demanded, "we come to offer our counsel regarding the proposed changes to imperial governance." The Emperor studied the High Lords with senses that penetrated beyond mere appearance, seeing in their postures and micro-expressions the calculations of beings who had wielded power so long they could not conceive of existence without it. "Speak freely," he commanded, though his tone carried implications that suggested freedom had limits. "The Imperium has endured for 10,000 years through established procedures and proven institutions," Tiron replied carefully. "Dramatic changes, however well-intentioned, risk destabilizing systems that protect billions of imperial citizens." What followed was a diplomatic dance of enormous complexity, as entrenched interests sought to preserve their positions while acknowledging the impossibility of openly defying the Emperor's will. The Master of the Administratum argued for gradual implementation over centuries rather than decades. The Fabricator General suggested that any changes to technological doctrine would require extensive testing to prevent catastrophic failures. The Lord Commander of the Imperial Navy expressed concern about maintaining fleet readiness during organizational transitions. The Emperor listened to each objection with patient attention. Yet, his responses demonstrated the same tactical brilliance that had once conquered a galaxy. Where direct confrontation would have triggered institutional rebellion, he offered compromise that preserved essential functions while gradually shifting power toward more collaborative models. "The Adeptus Mechanicus will retain autonomy over technological development," he assured the Fabricator General, But new protocols will ensure that innovation serves human advancement rather than merely preserving ancient knowledge. To the master of the administratum, he offered expanded authority over resource allocation in exchange for implementing transparent governance structures that would make corruption more difficult to conceal. Change will be gradual but inevitable, the emperor declared as the formal session concluded. Those who adapt will thrive. Those who resist will be replaced, not through purge or punishment, but through obsolescence, as more effective systems prove their worth. The reforms that began implementation over the following weeks represented the most significant changes to imperial governance since the Great Crusade itself. The Astronomicon, now guided by the emperor's restored knowledge, began broadcasting not merely navigational data, but carefully crafted messages that carried hope rather than mere duty. Astropaths throughout the galaxy reported unprecedented clarity in their communications, as if the psychic static that had plagued the Imperium for millennia was finally clearing. New schools of psychic development opened on Terra and throughout the core worlds, their curricula designed by the Emperor himself to emphasize understanding rather than mere power. Where previous training had focused on suppressing psychic abilities or channeling them into narrow military applications, these institutions taught psychers to see their gifts as tools for human advancement rather than weapons of war. The Space Marine legions received new directives that emphasized their role as protectors rather than conquerors. Recruitment protocols shifted to prioritize candidates who showed not merely physical prowess, but moral character and intellectual capacity. The superhuman warriors who had once embodied humanity's martial fury would be transformed into exemplars of its highest aspirations. Yet perhaps the most significant change was the Emperor's decision to address the Imperium directly, not through intermediaries or official proclamations, but through a psychic broadcast that reached every human mind in the galaxy simultaneously. The message that blazed across human consciousness was unlike any communication in recorded history. It carried not the distant authority of a god-emperor, but the intimate honesty of a father acknowledging his failures to his children. "People of the Imperium," the Emperor began, his words reaching from Terra to the furthest frontier worlds. "I speak to you not as your master, but as the architect of a system that has demanded too much sacrifice for too little hope. For 10,000 years you have endured in my name. Now I ask you to hope in humanity's name." The acknowledgement that followed sent shock waves through every level of imperial society. The Emperor admitted to mistakes that had cost countless lives. He spoke of choices made from necessity that had created suffering without purpose. Most remarkably, he asked for forgiveness, not as a divine being granting absolution, but as a flawed leader seeking to make amends for harm he had caused. "The Emporium you have known was built for survival in a hostile galaxy," he continued. "The Imperium we will build together is meant for growth toward something greater. This transformation will not be easy, nor will it be swift. But it begins now, with acknowledgement that humanity deserves better than mere existence." The response across the galaxy was as varied as humanity itself. On worlds where imperial rule had been harsh and arbitrary, the Emperor's words sparked hope that had been dormant for generations. Rebellions that had simmered beneath the surface for centuries suddenly found themselves offered peaceful resolution rather than bloody suppression. Yet on other worlds, particularly those where the imperial faith had taken strongest root, the message triggered profound confusion and resistance. To populations that had been taught to worship the Emperor as a god, his admission of fallibility seemed like blasphemy rather than honesty. In the eye of terror, the Chaos gods themselves paused their eternal games to contemplate this unexpected development. An emperor who admitted mistakes and sought collaborative governance represented a threat they had not anticipated, not through power alone, but through the possibility that humanity might transcend the divisions and hatred upon which chaos fed. On Terra itself, the transformation continued with methodical precision. The ecclesiarchy found itself restructured from a militant faith into an institution focused on spiritual guidance and moral education. The Inquisition's authority was curtailed dramatically, with most of its previous functions transferred to new oversight bodies that emphasized transparency and accountability. The emperor established regular councils where his sons could debate policy openly, their disagreements seen as strength rather than weakness. Guilliman's administrative expertise, the Lion's strategic planning, and Russ's insight into human nature combined to create governance structures that drew from multiple perspectives rather than singular authority. As Terra's sun set on the first month of the new order, the emperor stood in the palace gardens, no longer bound to the golden throne except by choice rather than necessity. The withered form that had sustained him through 10,000 years of suffering had been restored to functionality through proper rest and nourishment, though the scars of his sacrifice would remain forever. Beside him walked his sons, no longer distant figures reporting on their accomplishments, but family members sharing their concerns and hopes. The conversation that passed between them carried the weight of genuine affection rather than mere duty. "Do you believe it will work, Father?" Guilliman asked, as they paused before a memorial garden dedicated to those lost during the recent crisis. "Can we truly transform something as vast and entrenched as the Imperium?" The Emperor was silent for long moments, his enhanced senses detecting the subtle changes already beginning to manifest across the galaxy. "Not in our lifetimes," he replied finally. "Perhaps not in 100 lifetimes, but the foundation has been laid and the direction chosen. Whether humanity builds upon it will depend on choices made by generations yet unborn." The new covenant had been established, not through conquest or decree, but through the patient work of healing wounds that had festered for millennia. The Imperium would never be the same, and perhaps, for the first time in 10,000 years, that was cause for hope rather than fear. The real test would come not in the dramatic moments of crisis, but in the daily choices that would shape humanity's future across countless worlds and generations. The Emperor had given his species a chance for something better. Whether they would take it remained to be seen. 6 months after the Emperor's restoration, the galaxy trembled with changes that rippled outward from Terra like waves across a cosmic ocean. Where once the Imperium had maintained its borders through force and fear, now diplomatic envoys carried messages that spoke of cooperation rather than conquest. The transformation was neither swift nor without resistance, yet its effects could be felt from the edge of the eastern fringe to the borders of the Eye of Terror. In the depths of the maelstrom, chaos warbands that had raided imperial space for millennia found themselves facing an enemy that no longer responded predictably to their provocations. The desperate fury that had once characterized imperial responses was being replaced by something far more dangerous, calculated restraint that sought to understand rather than merely destroy. Yet not all of the chaos forces responded with increased aggression. On the demon world of Sicarius, deep within the Eye of Terror, an unexpected message reached the court of a being who had once been called Fulgrim. The Phoenician, transformed by millennia of service to Slanesh, into something that transcended both beauty and horror, listened to his father's words with senses that operated beyond mortal comprehension. "He offers forgiveness," Fulgrim mused to his assembled followers, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself shiver with anticipation. "After 10,000 years of enmity, our father extends his hand in reconciliation rather than retribution." The response from his warband was immediate and violent, some seeing opportunity where others perceived trap. Yet beneath the cacophony of debate, something stirred that had not existed since the dark days of the heresy, the possibility that redemption might be achievable even for those who had fallen furthest into damnation. On Terra itself, the Emperor pursued a more personal form of reconciliation. The private audiences he held with each of his surviving sons revealed wounds that went far deeper than any physical injury, scars left by 10,000 years of abandonment and misunderstanding that no amount of psychic power could simply heal away. The Lion was first, his meeting with his father taking place in the palace gardens, as Terra's sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The conversation that passed between them carried the weight of centuries spent in stasis, of loyalty maintained despite receiving no acknowledgement or reward. "I waited," the Lion said simply, his voice carrying pain that 10 millennia had not diminished. "While my brothers led their legions to glory or damnation, I waited for your guidance that never came. When I finally awakened, it was to find the galaxy burning and my father transformed into something I no longer recognized." The Emperor absorbed his son's words with the patience of one who had learned to value honesty over comfort. "I failed you, not through malice or indifference, but through the arrogance of believing that duty required no explanation, that loyalty needed no nurturing. I asked you to trust without giving reason, to serve without receiving purpose." The healing that followed was neither instantaneous nor complete, yet it marked the beginning of understanding that had been absent for millennia. Each son carried different wounds: Guilliman's burden of impossible responsibility, Russ's guilt over actions taken in ignorance, even Magnus's corruption bore traces of love betrayed, rather than simple malice. Yet beyond the personal reconciliations, larger forces were beginning to respond to the Emperor's transformation. From the tomb worlds of the Necrons came signals that spoke to intelligence, vast and ancient, consciousness that had endured for millions of years, yet showed interest in humanity's sudden evolution. The message that reached Terra through carefully shielded astropathic channels was unlike any communication recorded in Imperial archives. It carried no threat or demand, merely observation and a question that defied easy categorization. Were humanity's changes genuine, or merely another mask worn by a species that had already proven its capacity for deception? "They watch us," the Emperor observed during a council session with his sons, his enhanced senses detecting patterns in galactic communication that suggested surveillance beyond normal Imperial detection capabilities. "The Necrons have noticed our transformation and seek to understand whether it represents genuine evolution or tactical deception." Guilliman's strategic mind immediately identified the implications. Do we respond? Any communication with them risks revealing capabilities they may not fully comprehend. "We observe and prepare," the Emperor replied. "If their interest proves benign, perhaps dialogue becomes possible. If hostile, at least we will not be surprised by their intentions." The changes spreading throughout the Imperium were not universally welcomed, even among humanity's own population. On worlds where Imperial faith had become central to social structure, the Emperor's admission of fallibility triggered religious crises that threatened to tear apart societies that had endured for centuries. The cardinal world of Ophelia VII became a focal point for resistance when Cardinal Ignatius declared the emperor's reforms to be the work of heretical influence rather than divine wisdom. The uprising that followed required careful handling, not the brutal suppression that would have characterized previous imperial responses, but patient demonstration of the reform's benefits, combined with protection for those who chose to embrace change. Force creates martyrs, the emperor explained to his sons as they coordinated the response to growing resistance movements. Understanding creates converts. We must be prepared to accept that some will never embrace transformation, but we cannot allow fear of change to perpetuate suffering. Perhaps the most surprising development came from sectors that had been lost to imperial control during the Age of Strife, worlds that had maintained human populations but rejected the imperium's authority for millennia. The emperor's message of cooperation, rather than conquest, opened diplomatic channels that had been closed since before the Great Crusade. The delegation from the Oretian technocracy arrived at Terra bearing gifts of knowledge rather than tribute, their representatives speaking of technologies that had been developed in isolation from imperial doctrine. Where previous imperial policy would have demanded submission or faced destruction, the new approach sought to understand what humanity had achieved when free from central control. They have solved problems we never recognized, reported tech adept Belisarius Call after examining Oretian innovations, his voice carrying wonder that transcended his mechanical modifications. Technological development that prioritizes sustainability over raw power, social structures that balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. Much of what they offer could benefit the entire imperium. The emperor established new institutions designed to foster such innovation throughout imperial space. Academies that encouraged questioning rather than mere repetition, research centers that pursued knowledge for its own sake rather than immediate military application. The technological stagnation that had characterized the imperium for millennia began to show signs of reversal as minds long constrained by doctrine found themselves free to explore possibilities that had been forbidden. Yet with each passing month, the scope of the transformation became more apparent, and with it the recognition that the changes would require far more time than any single lifetime could provide. The emperor's enhanced consciousness, capable of perceiving patterns across centuries, began to grasp the true magnitude of what he had undertaken. 10,000 years of accumulated tradition cannot be changed in a generation, he confided to Gilliman during one of their regular strategic planning sessions. What we begin here may not reach fruition for centuries. We are planting seeds that our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren may finally see bear fruit. The Lion, ever practical in his assessments, identified the strategic challenges such long-term planning presented. How do we ensure continuity across such spans of time? How do we prevent the reforms from being corrupted or abandoned when those who remember their purpose are no longer present to guide them? The answer lay not in rigid doctrine, but in flexible principles, institutions designed to evolve rather than stagnate, leadership structures that prevented the accumulation of absolute power, educational systems that taught critical thinking rather than mere obedience. As Terra's sun set on the 6th month of the new order, the emperor stood once again in the palace gardens, but this time he was not alone. His sons walked beside him, their conversations carrying the easy familiarity of family rather than the formal distance of military hierarchy. The transformation of their relationship mirrored the larger changes sweeping through the imperium, healing that required time, patience, and the willingness to acknowledge painful truths. "Do you regret it?" Russ asked, as they paused before a memorial dedicated to those lost during the recent crisis. "Choosing to remember? Accepting the burden of knowledge you had excised?" The Emperor considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I regret the necessity that drove me to forget. I regret the pain my ignorance caused while I remained unable to provide proper guidance. But the forgetting itself?" He paused, his enhanced perception touching the edges of possibilities that stretched across the centuries. "No, forgetting taught me humility that absolute knowledge could not provide. Sometimes we must lose everything to understand what truly matters." The galaxy continued to burn with conflicts that predated humanity's first steps toward the stars, yet for the first time in 10,000 years, there was hope that those conflicts might one day be resolved through understanding rather than conquest. The Emperor's transformation had given humanity a chance for something better, though whether that chance would be seized remained a question that only future generations could answer. The real test would come not in the dramatic moments of crisis that had defined the Imperium's history, but in the quiet choices made by billions of individuals across countless worlds. The foundation had been laid, the direction chosen. Whether humanity would build upon it or allow it to crumble would depend on wisdom yet to be earned and courage yet to be tested. The Emperor had given his species hope. Whether they deserved it remained to be seen. 1 year after his awakening, the Emperor of mankind stood in the palace gardens as Terra's twin moons painted silver light across paths he had walked in freedom for the first time in 10 millennia. The withered form that had been bound to the golden throne by necessity had been restored not to the physical prime he had once possessed, but to functionality that allowed him to move among his people rather than merely observe them from distant elevation. The gardens themselves reflected the changes spreading throughout the Imperium, not the rigid, formal arrangements that had characterized imperial aesthetics for centuries, but living spaces that grew and adapted according to their own nature while guided by careful tending. It was, the Emperor reflected, an apt metaphor for what the Imperium itself was becoming. The assessment that occupied his thoughts carried the weight of honest evaluation rather than wishful thinking. In the year since his restoration, much had been achieved, yet perhaps more had been revealed about the magnitude of what remained to be done. The webway breach was sealed, the immediate threats to terror had been neutralized, and the basic framework for reform had been established. Yet the galaxy continued to burn with conflicts that predated human consciousness, and the wounds left by 10,000 years of necessity would require far more time to heal than any single lifetime could provide. Progress measured in decades rather than years, he murmured to the night air, his enhanced senses detecting the presence of one of his sons approaching through the garden paths. Guilliman emerged from the shadows between the trees, his massive frame moving with the careful quiet of one who had learned to respect moments of contemplation. The Lord Regent carried himself differently now, not with the crushing weight of absolute responsibility, but with the confident bearing of one who knew that burden was shared rather than borne alone. "Unable to sleep, Father?" Guilliman asked, settling onto a stone bench that had been positioned to overlook the memorial garden dedicated to those lost during the recent crisis. The Emperor joined his son, noting how natural such simple interaction had become after centuries of communicating only through intermediaries and formal audiences. Sleep has become optional. The body requires rest, but the mind finds itself occupied with patterns that span centuries. Tell me your assessment of our progress." Gilliman's response carried the measured analysis that had made him one of the Imperium's most effective administrators. 13 sectors have implemented the new governance protocols with measurable improvement in resource allocation and citizen welfare. The Astronomican's enhanced clarity has restored reliable communication to regions that had been isolated for decades. Educational reforms are beginning to show results in reduced incidents of psychic awakening trauma. He paused, his expression sobering. Yet resistance movements have emerged on 47 worlds, ranging from passive non-compliance to active rebellion. The ecclesiarchy's fragmentation has created regional power struggles that threaten stability in 3 entire subsectors, and the reports from the Eye of Terror suggest that our reforms have inspired chaos to adapt their strategies. The Emperor absorbed this information with the patience of one who had learned to measure success across spans of time that dwarfed individual lifetimes. Redemption is not a destination that can be reached through sufficient effort, my son. It is a choice that must be made again each day by every individual who participates in our civilization. The conversation that followed touched on matters both practical and philosophical: resource allocation for the coming decade, strategic responses to emerging threats, but also deeper questions about the nature of power and the responsibility that came with wielding it effectively. Where once the Emperor might have issued decrees that brooked no question, now he sought counsel and offered guidance rather than commands. "I have been considering stepping back from direct governance," the Emperor said, as their discussion drew toward its natural conclusion. "Not abandoning responsibility, but allowing the institutions we have created to function without constant intervention. Democracy cannot flourish under the shadow of absolute authority, regardless of how benevolently that authority is exercised." Guilliman's surprise was evident, despite his superhuman composure. "You would withdraw from active leadership? The Imperium has never existed without your direct guidance." "Which is precisely why such withdrawal is necessary," the Emperor replied. "The Imperium must learn to function as an expression of humanity's collective will rather than as an extension of mine. Safeguards are being established, institutions that will preserve essential knowledge, systems that will prevent the accumulation of absolute power, educational structures that will teach critical thinking rather than mere obedience. But ultimately, humanity must choose its own path." The weight of such a transformation pressed against both father and son as they contemplated its implications. To create a civilization that could function without the Emperor's constant oversight meant accepting that it might make choices he would not approve of, pursue paths he had not intended. Yet the alternative, eternal dependence on singular authority, had already proven its limitations through 10,000 years of stagnation. A subtle shift in the garden's atmosphere drew their attention to the approach of additional figures. The lion emerged from the shadows with his characteristic silent grace, followed by Russ, whose enhanced senses had detected the gathering through means beyond normal perception. Without words, the 3 Primarchs joined their father in contemplation that had become ritual over the passing months. "New reports from the frontier sectors," the lion said finally, his tactical mind never fully at rest. "Tau expansion fleets are requesting diplomatic contact rather than engaging our forces directly. The Eldar have sent cryptic messages that suggest interest in our reforms. Even some Necron tomb worlds appear to be observing rather than attacking." The Emperor nodded slowly. "The galaxy watches to see whether our transformation is genuine or merely another mask worn by the same underlying nature. Time will provide that answer more effectively than any words we might offer." Russ shifted restlessly, his warrior's instincts struggling with concepts that could not be resolved through direct action. And if they decide we represent a threat to their interests, if our success inspires them to unite against us, then we face that challenge as we have faced all others, the Emperor replied, but with strategies adapted to our new understanding, rather than reflexive repetition of old patterns. The galaxy has seen enough of conquest and domination. Perhaps it is ready for examples of cooperation and growth. As the night deepened around them, the conversation turned to personal matters, not the grand strategies that had dominated their relationship for millennia, but the simple exchanges that family members shared when they no longer needed to maintain formal distance. The Emperor spoke of dreams that visited his rest, visions of humanity's potential that stretched beyond the constant warfare that had defined its existence. His sons shared their own hopes and concerns, their observations of changes spreading throughout their respective spheres of responsibility. Yet beneath the growing intimacy of restored family bonds lay acknowledgement of wounds that might never fully heal. The traitor Primarchs remained beyond reach of redemption, their corruption too complete for any approach save vigilant defense. Worlds that had been lost to chaos or Xenos influence would require generations to recover, if they could be recovered at all. The scars left by 10,000 years of necessity would mark human civilization for millennia to come. Some prices cannot be paid, the Emperor observed, as they prepared to conclude their vigil. Some choices cannot be unmade. We can only ensure that the lessons learned through suffering are not forgotten, and that future generations inherit wisdom rather than merely repeating our mistakes. The Primarchs departed one by one, returning to their own responsibilities and contemplations, until the Emperor stood alone among gardens that bloomed under starlight, filtered through Terra's ancient atmosphere. His enhanced senses detected the vast complexity of the world beneath his feet, billions of human beings pursuing their own lives and dreams, largely unaware of the cosmic forces that shaped their existence, yet contributing through their simple choices to the collective destiny of their species. For 10,000 years, he had borne the weight of humanity's survival alone, sustained only by will and the terrible certainty that failure meant extinction. Now, for the first time since the dark days of the heresy, that burden was shared among family members who understood its weight and institutions designed to distribute its impact across countless individuals, rather than concentrating it in a single consciousness. The Emperor began his walk back toward the imperial palace, no longer constrained to the golden throne except by choice rather than necessity. The path ahead stretched not merely through the garden's carefully tended spaces, but across centuries of careful growth that would test every principle he had sought to establish. Success was far from guaranteed. Humanity might choose to abandon the reforms in favor of familiar authoritarian comfort, or external threats might force regression to patterns of survival that prioritized strength over wisdom. Yet as he paused at the garden's edge to look back across the memorial spaces where those lost during the recent crisis were honored, the Emperor felt something he had not experienced since before the heresy: genuine hope rather than mere determination. Humanity had been given a chance to become something better than what necessity had required it to be. Whether that chance would be seized or squandered remained a question that only future generations could answer. But for the first time in 10 millennia, the possibility of genuine answer existed. The master of mankind walked through his palace not as a god among mortals, but as a father among children who had finally learned to stand on their own. The great work that had begun with humanity's first steps toward the stars continued, But now it proceeded not through the vision of a single consciousness, but through the collective will of a species that had finally begun to understand its own potential. The war for humanity's soul would never truly end. But perhaps it no longer needed to be fought alone.